I wasn't worth a cent 2 years ago, and now I owe $2 million. So goes Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, which gives the name to this era in American history. Twain called it gilded because it was glittering on the surface, corrupt underneath. And it was a time that glittered with dazzling fortunes. Just don't ask too many questions about where they came from, because that part was less dazzling. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. It's 1876, and the United States of America is celebrating its 100th birthday. Let's take stock, shall we? On the subject of race relations, much legislation had been passed to ensure civil rights since the end of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment had established the rights of citizenship for all born in the United States of America, including those who had been born in bondage. And the 15th Amendment had established the right to vote for Black Americans. The Civil Rights Acts of 1870 and 1871, or the Force Acts, allowed federal forces to protect Black voters, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed equal access to public accommodations like inns and theaters, and prohibited racial discrimination and jury service. As we've seen, great strides have been made in a short time to improve Black literacy rates and establish places of higher education. With the right to vote upheld by the Force Acts, voters were able to elect Black representatives at the local, state, and federal level. One Black man, Hiram Revels, even took the Senate seat once held by President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. As a result of increased educational opportunities, as well as legislators who stood up for Black rights, the wealth gap between white and Black Americans had decreased significantly in the years after the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people were able to acquire assets of their own. But despite all this progress, there were still causes for concern. The Klan continued to terrorize Black voters, as well as Black legislators, despite the presence of federal forces. Too often, Black families were forced to resort to sharecropping, a system that afforded no real way for them to get ahead. What about women? How would Abigail Adams, who had asked her husband at the Continental Congress to not forget the ladies, judge America's progress in that regard 100 years on? At the state level, there were some gains for women. Both Utah and Wyoming had granted women the right to vote. But at the national level, they were still denied, with an 1875 Supreme Court ruling stating that although they were citizens, they were not guaranteed to vote. Perhaps the most telling incident for gauging the status of women in America was the gift of a large statue from France to commemorate the United States' 100th birthday. On seeing the plan, some women's rights campaigners were outraged, as they found it cruelly ironic that liberty was personified as a woman. Economically, things were going gangbusters. Industry was thriving, with the rest of the world coming to see the United States of America as potentially the next global superpower. The 1870s were experiencing a period of deflation, following financial panic. This was great news for wealthier Americans, who now got lower prices. But for the working classes, it meant their wages fell too. Fortunately, the Gilded Age saw the rise of corporate retailers like Marshall Field's and Macy's, whose size allowed them to cut prices to cater to a wider range of consumers. Entrepreneur Aaron Montgomery Ward pioneered the mail-order catalog, meaning that now people from anywhere could order anything they wanted. They could order dry goods, such as coffee, in bulk, which was more cost-effective because of the savings per unit. Before these innovations, most people would make many of their things by hand, or take costly time out of their day to procure it. Alexis de Tocqueville's pronouncement that man takes pleasure in honest and legitimate pursuit of well-being by wanting to improve everything around him had finally come true, as the advances in technology and societal influences allowed life overall to be more pleasant for more people. But, de Tocqueville had warned, this was a double-edged sword. People could and should pursue happiness through prosperity, but materialism is a dangerous sickness of the mind. More people were aspiring higher, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Then as now, the best way to do this was through education. The nation continued to retain as strong and puritanical streak as it ever had, with its emphasis on values like hard work and public education. By 1875, it was estimated that the literacy rate was 80%, though the definition of literacy in the 19th century was much more basic than our current standard. Elementary education was a bedrock American value, but the country was still falling behind in terms of secondary education. Maybe 2% of adult men went to college, never mind graduate school. Many country lawyers like Abraham Lincoln were simply self-taught. And as for the state of medicine at the time, some physicians might train in the most cutting-edge techniques at one of the few medical schools in the country, but most likely the local doctor apprenticed with the local doctor before him. For those not living in cities, the doctor was potentially the only one for miles, so it might take a while for him to get to you. And when he did, usually the best cure he could offer you was something deeply unpleasant, like leeching or a purgative. Probably best to avoid calling the doctor altogether if you could help it. For America's 100th birthday, the government threw a huge centennial celebration to show off to the world just how far America had come. The Centennial Fair ran from May 10th to November 10th, 1876, in the place where it all began, Philadelphia. It was a massive undertaking for the city and the country, with the Exposition Committee building 5 gigantic exhibition halls. The main building enclosed 21 acres, the largest building in the world at the time, designed in the latest Beaux-Arts style. Its long central corridor took the visitor past exhibits on mining, metallurgy, manufacturing, education, and science. Since the 1840s, copper and iron mining had brought prosperity to the Great Lakes region and started the country on its path to a second industrial revolution. It was the iron ore that was the driving force. Iron is the primary ingredient in steel, an alloy that is a stronger and more durable metal, yet more practical than stone or brick. Not only were the rails that were crossing the country being built of the more reliable steel, but the use of steel in the construction of buildings allowed them to rise higher without fear that they would collapse, as well as miraculous bridges and ships that could now be lighter and more flexible, yet far stronger. The Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, local to Pennsylvania, had just adopted the Bessemer technique for creating steel. Through this method, a converter would blow air through molten iron to remove any impurities, greatly reducing the time that it took to produce steel. Time means money, and therefore this faster process significantly cut the cost of steel, allowing its widespread adoption, a development which the exposition heralded as ushering in an age of steel. Steel was certainly one pillar of the coming Industrial Revolution. Coal was another. The efficiency and horsepower that steam created meant that more steam was needed as cities and businesses converted their horse cars and other processes to steam power. And to get more steam, they required the reliable fuel source of coal. The Second Industrial Revolution is really like that question of the chicken and the egg. What really comes first? The coal allows the nation to build more steam engines and more trains with greater horsepower, and the mining of such a vast quantity of coal requires more widespread systems of transportation. It becomes a vicious cycle where progress fuels even more progress. The factory, the beating heart of the first industrial revolution, began with the water wheel, which powered the process of turning raw fiber into fabric. Now advances in science and technology meant that so many products could be mass-produced in factories, making them cheaper overall. An abundance of raw goods in America meant that more factories were needed to turn them into finished products, and more factories meant the need for more labor. The need for labor drove the influx of immigrants seeking these opportunities. The Immigration Act of 1864 allowed employers to entice immigrants to come to America for employment. The law was repealed in 1868 due to sustained protests by labor organizations, but not before a wave of immigrants looking for jobs building the railroads or smelting iron had come to permanently settle in the United States. A large number of these recent arrivals were from China, as it was undergoing a period of serious unrest during the 1860s. They came to California to build the railroads, starting in the west, to eventually meet up with track coming from the east to create the first transcontinental railroad. Irish immigrants as well, continuing to come to America even after the Great Famine, made up an eager and abundant workforce for the factories and the coal mines and the foundries. Unfortunately, an increased labor pool meant that factory owners could afford to keep wages cheap, something they were eager to do with the era's mass deflation. But it also meant that goods could be produced faster, and therefore sell for cheaper. The economic theory of creative destruction states that any advance in technology, or in society, will shift the balance of the entire economy, causing the death of certain industries and forms of employment. It's inevitable. But with this change also comes opportunity. New industries develop and create new career paths. As the rise of the railroads had pretty much killed off the canals, so too would cheap factory labor and mass production begin to transform the economy from a series of smaller regional ecosystems to a larger national market. And of course, this meant, even more than the first industrial revolution, that the nature of work for ordinary people became more varied. People now had options that they wouldn't have before. At the opening ceremony of the Centennial Exposition, President Ulysses S. Grant made a speech regarding education and opportunity. Let us all labor to add all needful guarantees for the more perfect security of free thought, free speech, and a free press, pure morals, unfettered religious sentiments, and of equal rights and privileges to all men, irrespective of nationality, color, or religion. America was the place where a man, as you'll notice women don't get a mention, could transform himself into something else. Ingenuity, self-discipline, and hard work, the John Jacob Astor School of Thought. Now was the time of leaps and bounds in progress, where raw materials were being harvested and harnessed to power new technologies. It was the opportune moment for people with ideas that could improve efficiency to share them with the world. Again, we're presented with the question, chicken or egg? Necessity is the mother of invention, and there certainly was the need for time and resource-saving processes. But as industrialization sped up, it began to create conditions that opened the way for new possibilities, conditions that had never existed before. We've already discussed the telegraph, the invention that made communication possible during the Civil War. Now people wondered, would it be possible to make communication even more efficient by transmitting actual sound via wire? Scottish inventor Alexander Graham Bell was the first person to do this successfully, and he patented his invention in 1876, calling it the telephone. And if you could transmit sound in spoken word, the idea that you could then capture it and record it for posterity, like a photograph, no longer seems outrageous. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, as he would come to be known, set about making this, and many other questions, into realities. It would have seemed an amazing time to be alive, when the solutions to everyday problems and nuisances were achievable with enough grit and brain power. In Machine Hall, there was a giant coreless engine, which when turned on, would power all the other machines. Grant, along with the Emperor of Brazil, were there at the opening to start this technological marvel. It was an international recognition that America was coming into its own as a technological powerhouse, capable of great engineering feats and manufacturing might. One of the machines featured was the sewing machine. Technically, some form of the sewing machine had existed since the late 18th century. By the 1840s, early American versions of the sewing machine began to appear, and by the 1850s, the Singer model came into circulation. The Brooks brothers had debuted ready-to-wear suits back in the 1840s. It still wasn't a widely available option, meaning that, like they always had, women still needed to mend and resize and modify their clothing. Only now with a sewing machine, that chore could become less time-consuming. Another modern miracle was the internal combustion engine. All of the power of a steam-powered engine contained neatly within a portable device. The coreless and the sewing machine both represented how life was improving before people's eyes wherever they looked. But the internal combustion engine presented a tantalizing glimpse of where the future might be headed. For an industrial revolution to occur, the conditions necessary to allow people to move away from agricultural labor and leave the production of food to a smaller segment of the population is the confidence that agricultural workers will be able to produce a surplus, and that non-agricultural workers will have the means to afford it. And as these non-agricultural workers grow in number, they power more industrialization and more advances that allow farmers to produce even more efficiently. Chicken and egg. Innovations in harvesting meant cheaper food. By the 1870s, farmers were incorporating mechanical and steam-powered devices for plowing, husking, shelling, and milking. But cheaper agricultural products also meant that smaller farmers got squeezed, finding it difficult to pay their bills when they were no longer making the same profit. In the 1870 census, farmers were in the minority of Americans for the first time ever, as more people started leaving agricultural labor for more lucrative opportunities. This period marks the beginnings of the trend toward agricultural consolidation and increased government aid to keep farmers afloat. Memorial Hall still stands today. In 1876, this was the Exposition's art museum. The exhibit received so many submissions that it needed a separate space just to house them all. The organizers wanted to show the world that American taste and talent could compete with European countries. It represented that for a significant segment of the population, life was no longer so consuming that a family couldn't take a leisurely day to take in the finer things. Enjoyment of the arts, something that might have been previously only an option for people of a certain class, could be for the masses. And there was no barrier to patronage of artists and artistic institutions, so long as you had the money. The dining options for visitors to the exposition were many and varied, but most people complained that they could only afford the popcorn. Perhaps this was an apt metaphor for America in 1876. Sometimes there are rips in the fabric of time, little openings that create the opportunity for immense success, if you happen to be in the right place at the right time. Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his book Outliers. In the 1860s and 1870s, the American economy went through perhaps the greatest transformation in its history. This was when the railroads were being built and Wall Street emerged. It was when industrial manufacturing started in earnest. It was when all the rules by which the traditional economy had functioned were broken and remade. If you were born in the late 1840s, you missed it. You were too young to take advantage of that moment. If you were born in the late 1820s, you were too old. Your mindset was shaped by the pre-Civil War paradigm. But there was a particular 9-year window that was just perfect for seeing the potential that the future held. These Goldilockses are the robber barons. The first of these is actually a little outside the window that Malcolm Gladwell has identified. He's a bit of a holdover from an earlier era. Cornelius Vanderbilt started his career working on his father's ferry in the early 19th century, moving passengers and freight around New York Harbor. As a teenager, he invested in his own vessel, ferrying people and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan, expanding and always taking an interest in what was new and what was next in the transportation industry, transitioning from his harbor ferry service to ocean-going vessels. That's why he took such an interest in the nascent railroads, eventually selling off his ferry business so that he could invest entirely in rail lines at a very opportune time, just as the Civil War was coming to an end. Through consolidation of railroads and the construction of a new Grand Central Terminus on Park Avenue, Vanderbilt was reshaping the nation and providing the base on which the other barons built. John D. Rockefeller was an accountant in Cleveland at a very exciting time. Cleveland was home to many petroleum refineries since it was an important railroad hub near the oil fields of Pennsylvania. Rockefeller saw the refining business up close and thought he could do better. He acquired his own small refinery in 1863 and set about transforming the oil business. The process of vertical integration is when a company takes control of every step in the supply chain, every process that transforms the raw material into the finished product. J.D. Rockefeller was a master at vertical integration. It allowed him to deeply discount his oil, undercutting competing refineries in Cleveland and driving them toward bankruptcy. His Standard Oil Company eventually acquired most of the refineries in Cleveland, basically eliminating the competition. The railways were essential to Rockefeller's enterprise, and the rapid growth of the railroad industry created the opportunity for another business mogul to make his fortune. Andrew Carnegie was born to a working-class family in Scotland. Coming to America as a teenager, he was eager to make his fortune and exploit the opportunities provided by the rapidly changing political and economic situations. Right at the end of the Civil War, he saw that the future lay in the railroads and the opening of the West through a transcontinental line. But instead of trying to compete with the better established players like Vanderbilt, he turned his attention to an industry that the growing railways couldn't do without: steel. Establishing ironworks in Pittsburgh, he adopted the Bessemer process, that technique for removing impurities, and adapted it for high-volume manufacturing, just in time to create all the rails that the Transcontinental Railroad would need. Like Rockefeller, he realized if he streamlined his entire enterprise, putting himself in charge of every step of the process, he could cut costs and overtake all of his competitors. Rockefeller and Carnegie weren't just creating businesses, they were creating empires. All the robber barons turned to one banker, J.P. Morgan. Starting his own bank in 1871, his primary interest was railroads. He was shrewd enough to acquire large enough interests in individual railroads to be able to dictate how they were organized and have a say in what lines merged and consolidated. But he wasn't, strictly speaking, a free market capitalist. In Morgan's view, competition was bad for business. His business, that is. His Morganization strategy did serve some purpose. Competition between railroads could get out of control, with different companies building lines to nowhere and creating completely conflicting timetables. But Morgan became a zealot for non-competitive business models, believing that they were the most efficient, in that they made the most money. A trust is a legal arrangement where ownership of assets is transferred to a trustee, who then makes all major decisions about those assets for trust beneficiaries. These were J.P. Morgan's bread and butter. Morgan would advise his clients, leaders in various industries, to come together for their collective benefit, rather than competing against each other. All that would do was cut into profits. If the different companies within an industry instead pooled their business interests, they could see maximum profits together. All the players could agree on how much to charge their customers and how much to pay their workers, without fear that these people might go somewhere else. If an upstart competitor had the idea to lower prices or pay higher wages, they could be easily put out of business due to the sheer size and power of the trusts. Rockefeller and Carnegie had begun the process of industry domination through vertical integration, taking control over every step of the process. Now, Morgan perfected it through horizontal integration, swallowing up the majority of the market in his trusts, and really affording the public no other options. This resulted in unfathomable fortunes for the beneficiaries of these trusts. With this wealth, unheard of amounts of money, what was there to do beside build palaces to rival those of the old money of Europe? One of the heirs of the vast Vanderbilt fortune built himself a castle in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, the gigantic Chateau Biltmore. A 3-mile railroad had to be constructed just to bring building materials to the site, almost 5,000 tons of Indiana limestone. The interior furnishings were all purchased abroad, and the grounds were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect of Central Park. The estimated cost in today's dollars? Well over $1 billion. Great palaces started to spring up all throughout New York City and Chicago, as well as in Rhode Island, where the fashionable set would summer. Richard Morris Hunt, architect of the Biltmore, blended French, Italian, and Gothic architecture into a hybrid Beaux-Arts style that came to characterize the wealthier streets of Manhattan. Architecture firm McKeed, Kim & White was the other designer of fabulous houses, chateaus in the middle of the city. Such artistry and craftsmanship had only previously been known in Europe, but American architects, who all trained overseas, recognized that America was now the place where all the money was. When robber barons had finished building their mansions and summer homes, and still realized they had a ridiculous amount of money to burn, many of them turned to collecting. J.P. Morgan collected such a vast collection of books that he had to build an entire other structure just to house his library. Henry Clay Frick accumulated art from the Dutch and Italian Renaissance to more contemporary Impressionist works. Both collections are now museums open to the public, as are many of the other cultural institutions that they patronized. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, though not in its original location, was also established during this time period, overseen by the great financier collectors of the time. Similarly, the Metropolitan Opera is no longer in its original location, but unlike the Metropolitan Museum, its history is much more contentious. Angered by the fact that they were not allowed to have their own boxes at the already established Academy of Music, the nouveau riche decided to build their own opera house to put the older one to shame. America might have been the land of opportunity, and New York City the place where those dreams could come true, but not everyone loved the idea of welcoming the self-made men into society. The old families of New York, the ones whose fortunes had come from owning large tracts of land in the days before the city expanded, could trace their family lines back to before the Revolution, some even to the days of Dutch New Amsterdam. Though America's brand is very much anti-nobility and inherited status, the irony seemed to be lost on women such as Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, who kept a tight leash on who was and wasn't accepted in New York high society. Though it's important to note that, although she personally was descended from the Dutch, she had married the grandson of John Jacob Astor. Remember that guy who had been born to a poor butcher in Germany and only came to America after the Revolution? Yeah, not sure how people were able to look past that part. Her ballroom, the site of which is now the Empire State Building, could fit 400 people for her magnificent balls. To be one of those 400 was to have made it in New York City. And the robber barons, while far wealthier, were considered far too gauche with their ostentatious palaces, rather than the sensible plain brownstones of the older families. Though perhaps what this mostly came down to was fear. The city and the country were ever-changing at a rapid pace, and those without hustle were in danger of being left behind. Edith Wharton wrote of this world in The Age of Innocence, a time of strict custom and etiquette. The ladies were elegant and the men were debonair. People dined at Delmonico's, took leisurely carriage rides through Central Park, shopped at the new several-story retail palaces near Madison Square, and went for tea at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Tiffany & Co., the Manhattan jeweler, became so well regarded that the company won the gold medal for jewelry and silver medal for silverware at the Paris Exposition in 1878. New York society could now compete with any in Europe, and they certainly had far more money to burn. The parties of the 400 were written up breathlessly in the newspapers, featuring pictures of the who's who of society dressed in their finest. Mothers sent their daughters to Europe for an education and to potentially find themselves husbands with titles. Britain's landed nobility were certainly struggling, and cash-strapped lords could use an injection of American money to keep the family estate afloat. There was no clearer sign that the tables had turned, and whose star was in the ascendant. Britain might have once been the mother country, but now it was America's time to shine. The United States had supplanted Great Britain as the world's economic powerhouse, for better and for worse. Once you've built yourself a palace or two, set yourself up in style, collected your fill of art and books, thrown the most lavish parties the country has ever seen, and snagged your daughter a duke to marry, and still you have money to burn, you could always turn to philanthropy. Cornelius Vanderbilt had endowed Vanderbilt University in 1873, and J.P. Morgan helped found the Natural History Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Andrew Carnegie would get into philanthropy later in his life as well, but their charitable giving generally went to cultural institutions and institutions of higher learning, which are great, but didn't do much to alleviate the suffering they were causing. In 1889, a nice spot for wealthy robber barons to go and relax was the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. This exclusive retreat was serviced by the South Fork Dam, a structure that when it sprung leaks, which was often by 1889, would simply be patched up with sticks and mud. So it wasn't really a surprise when after several days of heavy rainfall, the dam burst. The resulting flood rushed through Johnstown, killing 2,208 people and causing millions of dollars of damage. Survivors were unable to recover damages from the club or any of its members. Everything usually went the robber barons' way, because their money made the rules. They could buy judges and politicians who, if not outright bribed, at the very least owed their positions to some wealthy industrialist. So how else could they be expected to rule? But money in politics wasn't new, and corruption had become especially problematic in the 1870s. Societies that came together to influence politics within their community or social spheres had existed since the beginning of the Republic. Tammany Hall had been a force in New York politics since the 1850s, and William, or Boss, Tweed had been in charge since 1863. Tammany Hall provided assistance to Irish Catholic immigrants seeking housing or work, and all it asked in return was their votes. You couldn't get anywhere in democratic politics in New York without the Boss Tweed stamp of approval, and he'd naturally expect a little something in return for his endorsement. Graft in the federal government was out of control as well, thanks to railroad money. Railroad magnates laundered money to congressmen they hoped might be favorable by opening a fake company, Credit Mobilier, and granting them shares at below market price. Two of President Grant's vice presidents ended up caught in the middle of the scandal. Meanwhile, most of the rest of the country didn't benefit at all. A compromise in 1876 had brought a contentious election to a conclusion. It was another of those no-majority winner situations. The compromise established this: Grover Cleveland would become president, and in return, Republicans would agree to the end of Reconstruction. In just 11 short years, most people seem to have forgotten their anger over the Civil War, and why they even needed a Reconstruction in the first place. The Southern states were certainly more than happy to move on. But when the military moved out of the South, it left black families unprotected. The Klan lost no time in employing intimidation tactics to stop black men from voting. All white legislators were able to institute poll taxes and literacy tests that further restricted black men's access to the ballot box. As black families saw whatever power they did have erode, and those who committed acts of racial violence only became bolder, many felt there was no longer any life left for them in the South, and began to look for opportunities in the North. But white factory workers in the North had their own problems. To prop up all those magnificent fortunes, somewhere there needed to be an army of workers whose lives weren't so blessed. The brass below the guild. Real wages for factory workers were often only $1 or $1.50 a day, with Carnegie expecting his steelworkers to pull 12-hour shifts, sometimes 7 days a week, in extremely dangerous conditions. Safety precautions were non-existent, and there was no compensation for if you got hurt on the job and couldn't work anymore. Contracts could be short-term, with no guaranteed stable position. But there wasn't really much you could do about that, since all the industry players were engaged in fixing wages and labor practices, so that anywhere else you might want to go to work would be just as bad as where you had left. And then there were company towns. A company town was really insidious because it advertised itself as this ideal utopia for the worker. Communities were neatly planned with good housing and lots of scenic opportunities for recreation. But like this entire period in history, all that glitters is not gold. These communities were a bit like the Truman Show, little self-contained pockets where the inhabitants aren't meant to question anything. But listen, it's actually ideal. The company can provide everything you need: housing, community, an entire store with anything you could possibly want. Within limit, of course. All available for a reasonable amount of company tokens, or scrip. You're all right being paid in scrip, right? It's a type of currency that we, the company, determine the value of, and then, rather than selling items at the market rate, we assign them a number of scrip. Like prizes at Chuck E. Cheese. There's absolutely no flaw in this system whatsoever, except for maybe the teeny tiny possibility that your wages in scrip might not totally cover everything you might need at the company store. But not to worry. We can get you squared away with our credit program. We'll still let you buy the food you need to feed your family, but we will keep a tally of just how much you owe us. Just in case you thought about moving on to some other place of employment before you fully paid us what you owe to the company store. The song 16 Tons perhaps said it best.
You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
The average family size in the late 19th century was 5 people, and with the father's salary, they'd probably have just enough to get by. Maybe one of the children would have to leave school after 8th grade to start working full-time. But the hope was that at least one person in the family could graduate high school. This being America, after all, where someone with an education could go anywhere. But let's imagine, if this family is one of the 75% that live in the country, that the crop fails, or a vital piece of farm equipment breaks down and needs to be replaced. Will this family have to take out a loan to pay for the new equipment, or to tide them over for the year? There's no way they can pay that back until next year's crop comes in. God willing, nothing else goes wrong. Urban factory workers had the same struggle. Always one misstep or misfortune away from falling behind. All it would take is the breadwinner to fall sick or be injured on the job, or for the landlord to hike the rent. They'd run the risk of being evicted. Forget ever being able to save up to buy a house or start their own business. That one promising student in the family will probably have to start working in the factory too, whatever the consequences to their health might be. That's what living on the margin was like. Still is for countless Americans. It takes everything you have just to tread water, and leaves you without anything for the fight to get ahead. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the Tenement Museum is housed inside a series of 19th century apartment buildings. These apartments were small and cramped, located up a set of rickety stairs and an overcrowded hallway. Entire immigrant families would eat, sleep, do schoolwork and laundry in rooms without much space or privacy. And these were some of the nicer accommodations. Photojournalist Jacob Riis showed the living conditions for New York City's poorest, scandalizing people by the level of poverty in the same city as the 400 and their fabulous palaces. For this other half, there were some pleasures to be had. Vaudeville was beginning to emerge, and concert halls and saloons catered to people of every class. But that was only an option for people if they could get the time off. And if you worked in one of Carnegie's steel mills, that wasn't always an option. But what could people do? The industrialists of the age had them cornered. There had been strikes before in American history. Tailors, mill girls, and shoemakers had all organized to try to have their demands met, all temporarily and all unsuccessfully. Earlier trade associations, like the guilds of old, tried to stand up for the interests of their members, but they were totally unprepared for the pace of industrialization. Enter the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor. This grandiosely named organization had been founded in 1869, but it reached its greatest height under Terence Powderly, a man who wanted to unite all laborers against the forces of management. Their primary demand was the 8-hour workday, but they also wanted to end child and convict labor and introduce a graduated income tax. They also supported the idea of the cooperative, a member-owned and democratically elected business. They believed in a holistic approach to achieving their goals, arbitration with management, as well as education for laborers and political lobbying. The Knights of Labor might have been successful in their aims, if not for an unfortunate demonstration that turned violent. In Chicago in 1886, a stick of dynamite went off in Haymarket Square. No one saw who threw it, but it was aimed at police, who then opened fire into the crowd of protesters. 7 police officers and 4 civilians were killed. The negative blowback this event created for the Knights of Labor led to their decline. The organization would never again enjoy the same level of support. It seemed that maybe democracy and collective action couldn't stop the reign of the oligarchs. In the end, it would take a massive financial panic to cause the government to reassess. Epilogue. There is a scrappy idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which we use to embody this idea that you can come from anywhere, and through the sheer force of willpower and effort, make yourself a success. The ironic thing about this phrase is that, originally, it was meant to describe a task that's impossible. No one can shift their weight by pulling on their bootstraps. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of the fact that it was meant to be a joke, and earnestly convinced ourselves that the impossible is possible, that you can start from nothing, with no support, and expect fantastic results. It does happen very occasionally. Look at Andrew Carnegie, who really did start with basically nothing and become one of the wealthiest people in history. But he and the rest of the robber barons are by no means typical. You can't hold up their success as evidence that the system is working. They're the exception that proves the rule. Most of their success is built on the fact that they've used their influence to ensure that no one can actually challenge them going forward. They might have been able to find an opening in the system, but as soon as they were through it, they made sure to firmly shut the doors behind them. In the final days of the Roman Republic, after the conspirators had stabbed Julius Caesar, there was one final push against Caesar's protégés to stop Rome from turning into the dictatorship they feared. Both sides met for one final battle in Macedonia, at the ancient city of Philippi. It was a disaster for the Republican forces, but not because of any brilliance on the part of the pro-Caesar forces. The reason that the fight for the Republic failed was because the people's heart wasn't in it. To them, the Republic, which worked mainly for the rich patrician class, wasn't really a better option than life under Caesar's party. Julius Caesar had at least paid his troops handsomely, in effect making them more loyal to him than to the idea of Republican liberty, which worked much better in theory. President Rutherford B. Hayes wrote in his diary about the times he lived in. This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. So why would people stick their necks out for America? Fighting in wars, committing themselves to public service, if America isn't going to be there for them in return? Because if the American dream is no longer viable, then the social contract doesn't work. The Declaration of Independence promises a right to the pursuit of happiness. How can you convince anyone that's possible when these gigantic corporations have bought up all the resources and changed all the rules in their favor, with politicians and lawmakers under the sway of their money, instead of what is best for the people? If you recall all the way back in episode 2, I posed the question, would our Puritan ancestors recognize us if they met us today? The Gilded Age feels like a good place to revisit that question. You could argue that the accumulation of wealth and resources in this country has always come at the expense of others. You might even argue that it's difficult to acquire wealth and resources without exploiting others. But the Gilded Age is where things take a definite turn. The consolidation of so much wealth in so few hands occurred because these robber barons realized if you lower your overhead, radically trim the costs of production, you can maximize your profits like never before. Of course, the fat you are trimming is pay raises for your workers, safe facilities for them to work in, and any competition that might force you to offer a better product or one that came at a fair price. It's that twin inheritance conundrum. Part of our origin lies in Jamestown and the lessons we learned there. That model might have caused great human suffering, but it did make some people very wealthy. Their earliest arrivals in America were dying out there in the wilderness. The way they saw it, it was oppress or be oppressed. At least that's the mentality they had inherited from old European structures. So you could either slog it out like everybody else, or you could find a cheat code. Become the feudal lord you could have never hoped to be in the old world. Someone was going to do it. Why not you? But for the aristocratic example of Jamestown, there was another, more meritocratic model in Plymouth and Puritan New England. These people who couldn't find a place in Europe where they could worship freely were looking for somewhere different, somewhere that was free from all the old constraints. It was meritocratic because they were all coming from nowhere and starting with nothing. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps because that's all you have in the beginning. That was just the Puritan way. You're not trying to reach your potential just to get ahead. You're doing it because that's what's been ingrained into you. It becomes who you are. Making a ton of money was never the point. In fact, all that wealth is corrupting for the soul. It's what the Puritans found wrong with the world they left behind. Material considerations had made people lose sight of what was really important. If the whole point of them coming to a new world was because it was new and different, then why would they seek to make it the same as the old one? We have these two competing impulses within us, an angel and a devil on each shoulder. Right now, I fear the devil is winning. Perhaps it's the digital age we live in that's obsessed with what's new and what's next that drives us to consume. Or maybe because we've made everything more cheaply and now there's more of it. We feel that we have to have it simply because it exists. But this kind of ownership is fleeting and without much value. How much more does the stuff you own matter to you when you've cared for it for years, repaired it when it's worn down, and carried it with you with all its memories? Not reducing or reusing the things that we own is not only bad for our wallets and our environment, it's bad for our souls. We need to prioritize quality, things that have actual meaning to us, that someone took time and care in making, and we then take time and care in preserving. Which brings us to the next point. The nature of work needs to change. We prioritize short-term profit over the long-term health of our industries and the people who work in them. The products are cheap and the employees are overworked without any real hope of advancement or being able to support themselves. One consequence of the Industrial Revolution was a shift in the workforce from skilled craftsmen to more opportunities for unskilled laborers, who are easily replaceable and you could pay less. It's not the loss of specific skills so much that started to make workers in Carnegie steel mills replaceable. It was the loss of control in dictating the terms of their service. The fact that you had some leverage in the negotiation of the compensation of your labor. In the post-industrial society we're living in now, we seem to be experiencing the same thing. To make the most profit, companies need to spend far less, either on making the product or on compensating the people involved in the process. And although we realize that that's what's happening, it seems like we're powerless to stop it. Because now as then, we're up against the issue of financial incentive. This is something I'll get into more on the economics episode. But what this means in the context of the Gilded Age is that the gears of the economic machine stopped working. The best deal for consumers and for workers didn't win out, because the new class of corporate titans got together to ensure that it didn't. There were so few of them consolidated into the trusts that they could dictate the way things were. Human greed had sought to outsmart the normal incentive structure, and in that case, there could only be one remedy. That's next time.